think, Marge. All I need is a title.
In this episode of the Atheist Bible Study, we continue our slog through the book of Genesis, and we've come to the Tower of Babel, as well as the early stories relating to Abram. Our first topic is the story of the Tower of Babel, which has been the subject of some really neat research that was released in 2017 by the Smithsonian Institute. The biblical story of the Tower of Babel is very interesting when you take it along with the actual history of the Jewish people and the history and archaeology of the region around modern-day Iraq. The biblical story is quite scant on details about the tower, and it says nothing about any of the other details you're about to hear. Genesis 11 simply states that man in general, please note, decided to build a structure that would reach to heaven. God saw this as it was being constructed, decided it was a tremendous display of arrogance on the part of humanity, and, quote-unquote, confused the language of the people so that they could not understand each other. And according to the Bible, this is how we got all the different languages we see in the world today. Notably, some people say that the tower was destroyed by God, but please note that Genesis 11:8 only says that they stopped building the city, which actually makes no sense because the city where this structure was built was already established. And yes, the Tower of Babel existed back in ancient history, and its remains are still evident today. It was built as a Mesopotamian ziggurat, a temple to the god Marduk, and it was to be the crowning achievement of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II. This is important because it was this king who expanded the Babylonian Empire to include both Palestine and Egypt, and he was responsible for the conquest of the kingdoms of both Israel and Judah in the Bible and what is known as the Babylonian captivity, which created the Jewish people. It was during this period that Jewish writers authored the first few books of the Bible, and they borrowed heavily on myths, traditions, personal histories, and the people of the Babylonian captors. Let's take a quick look at a couple mountains you can see within 100 miles of Laramie, Wyoming. This first one here is Elk Mountain, as you can see it from roughly about 10 miles away. This one here is Jelm Mountain, which you can see from roughly 10 miles away. The point here is that these mountains are all pretty impressive, and you can see them from miles away. These mountains also have kind of the same shape as a ziggurat. Now, the one that King Nebuchadnezzar was building in Babylon was going to be roughly 7 stories tall, while the rest of the structures in the city were no higher than 2. The first 6 stories were built from mud brick, and so the structure would have appeared to be brown or tan. But the temple to Marduk, situated at the top of the ziggurat, was to have been done in lapis lazuli laced brick, so it would have appeared to be a dark blue. Now, the Babylonians only took the most educated of the peoples that they conquered back to Babylon. And this is important because these people were literate and could write about what they saw. And what they saw was a man-made version of this, rising out of the horizon to the east before they could see anything else in the city of Babylon. Even uncompleted, the ziggurat of Marduk in Babylon was a very impressive structure, and there was no doubt that the Jews who were forced to live in the city were impressed. But something happens when that first feeling wears off, and when that happened, the Jews began to associate the huge ziggurat with their captors and captivity, and so they wrote the story of the Tower of Babel not because God actually did anything, but as a way of tearing down the Babylonians, and this was understandable. But where does the part about confusing the languages come from? Archaeologists have discovered clay tablets detailing how the ziggurat was to be built. They state that the people from as far away as the upper and lower seas, referring to the Mediterranean Sea and the Persian Gulf, would be brought in to work on the tower. The Babylonian Empire had developed a writing system using imprinted blocks which could be imprinted into soft clay tablets, forming words. The entire process was called cuneiform. It was in wide use throughout the Babylonian Empire, and it was taught in the schools. When the Babylonian Empire fell, the teaching of cuneiform in the schools stopped, and the people forgot how to write it. So the biblical story refers to the disappearance of written language, not that suddenly no one could understand one another. This may place the writing of this story, and perhaps the entire book of Genesis, at about 500 BCE, because the Babylonian Empire collapsed in 537 BCE, and it was taken over by the Persian king Cyrus the Great. This would have given the authors time to have written the story, and time to notice that the study of cuneiform had vanished. They could then attribute this to the destruction of the hated symbol of their oppressors, a ziggurat, the top of which would have been crowned by a temple to a pagan god. I do not believe that the ziggurat temple to Marduk or the biblical Tower of Babel was ever completed. This is not because of the vindictive biblical account, but because none of the archaeological evidence indicated that it was. The clay tablets show what a completed tower would have looked like, and other tablets state how the temple would be built, but to my knowledge there is nothing saying that the ziggurat was completed. Also, please note that one can still find elements of the mud bricks used to construct the ziggurat at the site where it once stood. In fact, the archaeologist who has been studying the area for the last few years picked up a brick. However, none of the azure lapis lazuli lace brick has been found, but this simply means that the bricks may have been created only to be carried off later. As to why the tower or its ruins are not around today, while other ziggurats in the area are still around, archaeological studies of the area point us to some answers in history. In 331 BCE, Alexander the Great conquered Babylon, and he of course saw the ziggurat, which by this time had fallen into some level of disrepair. Alexander was impressed by this building, even in its crumbling state, and he wanted to refurbish it, so the ziggurat was disassembled with the intent that it would be rebuilt. However, Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE, so that work was not begun. What was not carried off for the refurbishment or carried off by other people simply stayed there and degenerated over time, although scientists can still detect elements of the mud brick near the foundation, and there are still single mud bricks that have survived to this day. To summarize the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, the story was written by people with an agenda. As in, they detested their captors and used the story to slight them, because of course, their god is far greater than Marduk, any other Babylonian god, or the Babylonians themselves. Even God's rationale for confusing the people slights the builders, and it then reveals other issues. If the tower could have been built to reach heaven, does that mean that heaven is a specific place? If so, where is it? The story of the Tower of Babel is another example in the book of Genesis of a bad story using bad but understandable motivations to come to false conclusions. Moving on, the bottom half of Genesis 11 introduces us to Abram by detailing his lineage. In the next chapter, God rather abruptly tells Abram to uproot his family and move to a land that he is shown. God gives his blessing to Abram and his family and leads them to the land of Canaan, which is modern-day Palestine. At some point after arriving in Canaan, a severe famine happened, and Abram decided to move his family to Egypt. However, en route, he became concerned that the Egyptians would find his wife to be beautiful, and they would kidnap her and kill him. So he told her to tell the Egyptians that she was his sister. Now, assuming that Abram actually existed for the purposes of this story, he was an incredible dunce. He did not think that the Egyptians would see his sister, find her beautiful, and want to take her for a wife, which is exactly what happened. And the prospective husband happened to be the leader of the entire country. In Genesis 12:17, God strikes the family and servants of the Pharaoh because they had unknowingly engaged in adultery. Pharaoh summons Abram and demands to know why he lied. He then has Abram and his family thrown out of the country. In an interesting turn, Isaac, Abram's son, later pulls the same stunt with Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, and in Isaac's case, he is found out when he is seen being romantic with his quote-unquote sister. Abimelech calls him on it, specifically saying that one of his men might have slept with her and brought guilt upon them. So in the case of Isaac and Abimelech, the lie was caught before anything happened, and Abimelech ordered his men not to harm Isaac or his wife. In the case of Abram, the lie went forward, and God punished the victims of the lie who were unaware of the true facts, rather than punishing Abram for perpetrating the lie. So in the next episode of the Atheist Bible Studies, we will look at the further adventures of Abraham and his family.